Imagine a young person, somewhere in the ancient world. They are healthy, their teeth are strong, unbroken, free of decay, and they are sitting down, willingly, because today their front teeth are going to be removed, not because of injury, not because of disease, not by accident, but deliberately, ceremonially, as a chosen and celebrated act. And when it is over, they will carry the gap in their smile for the rest of their life, and they will be proud of it. This sounds almost impossible to us. In the modern world, we spend enormous amounts of money and effort trying to keep our teeth. We straighten them, whiten them, replace them when they fail. The idea of deliberately removing a perfectly healthy front tooth seems not just strange, but backwards. And yet, for thousands upon thousands of years, across multiple continents and countless cultures, human beings did exactly this. The practice has a name. Archaeologists call it tooth ablation, or ritual dental modification. And it is one of the most widespread, longest-running, and least talked about traditions in the entire human story. So, why did they do it? Why would people across the world independently decide that removing healthy teeth was worth the pain? The answer is not what you would expect, and it opens a window into something profound about how human beings have always used their bodies to say who they are. Let us begin with how we know this happened at all, because the archaeology here is genuinely clever. When archaeologists uncover an ancient skull, they can tell a great deal from the teeth and the jaw. If a tooth was lost after death, through decay of the remains or damage in the ground, the empty socket remains open and sharp-edged. But if a tooth was removed while the person was alive, the body responds. Bone heals. The socket gradually closes and remodels itself over time, leaving a distinctive, smooth depression where the tooth once sat. This healing is the fingerprint of a tooth lost in life rather than in death. And when archaeologists find these healed sockets appearing in the same specific teeth in individual after individual across an entire population, they know they are not looking at accidents or disease. They are looking at a deliberate cultural practice, performed again and again according to a pattern. And the patterns are remarkably consistent. In one of the most thorough studies of this practice, published in 2024 in the journal Archaeological Research in Asia, the archaeologist Yue Zhang and her colleagues analyzed research from over 250 archaeological sites in Taiwan, tracing the practice of tooth ablation across the island. What they found was extraordinary. This was not a brief fashion or an isolated custom. The practice of removing healthy teeth in Taiwan can be traced back roughly 4,800 years, and it continued in various forms all the way into the early 1900s. That is a tradition that endured for nearly 5,000 years, and it was not confined to Taiwan. The practice appears to have spread with the ancient Austronesian peoples as they migrated outward, carrying it across Southeast Asia and into the Pacific Islands. A single cultural practice, traveling with a people across oceans, persisting for millennia. The specifics of what was removed were highly consistent. In ancient Taiwan, the teeth targeted were the upper front teeth, usually the incisors or the canines. Notice the significance of that choice. These are the most visible teeth in the human mouth, the ones you see when a person smiles or speaks. This was not about removing a troublesome molar hidden at the back. This was about the face, about what other people see. That alone tells us the practice was fundamentally about communication. And the methods, according to the research, varied by region in ways that are strikingly specific. In the northern parts of Taiwan, the preferred approach was to strike the tooth out using a tool of metal, wood, or stone. In the southern regions, a different technique was favored. There, the tooth was pulled, typically using one or two wooden or bamboo sticks with thread bound tightly around the tooth. Different communities, different techniques, but the same underlying practice. It was, in its own way, a technology, refined and passed down through generations. So we return to the great question. Why? Why would communities do this, generation after generation, for thousands of years? The researchers identified several distinct cultural motivations, and together they paint a fascinating picture of what these societies valued. The first and most frequently mentioned reason was beauty. This is difficult for us to grasp because our modern standards of beauty run in the opposite direction. But according to the research, the most commonly cited motivation was beautification, arising from a desire to distinguish oneself from the facial features of animals, and to enhance personal attractiveness. Consider that first part carefully, because it is profound. The idea was that prominent front teeth resembled the features of animals, and that removing them made a person look more distinctly, recognizably human. In other words, this was a deliberate act of separating the human from the animal, of marking oneself as a person rather than a creature. And beyond that, it was simply considered attractive within that cultural world. Beauty standards, we must remember, are not universal. They are made, shared, and inherited. What one culture finds beautiful, another may find bewildering, and the reverse is equally true. The second motivation was courage. Having a healthy tooth removed without modern anesthetic was undeniably painful, and rather than being a reason to avoid it, that pain was part of the point. Researchers note that the procedure was viewed as a test of courage, and that in many cases, the visible result was regarded as proof of bravery or a measure of maturity. Think about what this means. The gap in the smile was not merely decorative, it was evidence. It was a permanent, unfakeable public record that this person had endured something difficult without flinching. You could not buy it. You could not borrow it. You could not pretend. The only way to have that gap was to have gone through the ordeal. In the language of signaling theory, this is what makes it an honest signal. Its very costliness is what gives it meaning. The third motivation was identity and transition. In many societies practicing tooth ablation, the procedure marked a passage from one stage of life to another, most often the arrival of adulthood. Before the ceremony, you were a child. After it, you were something else, and everyone could see that at a glance for the rest of your life. It also served to mark group belonging, distinguishing members of one community from another. Researchers noted that the resulting patterns on the teeth could alter a person's expression and communication, potentially signaling that an individual had acquired a new status within their society. The mouth, in effect, became a permanent badge, announcing your maturity and your membership every time you spoke or smiled. And there was a fourth motivation, entirely practical and rather ingenious. Some historical accounts suggest that a gap where a front tooth had been could serve a life-saving purpose. If a person developed lockjaw, a condition where the jaw muscles seize and the mouth cannot be opened, that small gap allowed food, water, and medicine to be passed through. Researchers have suggested that this most pragmatic, life-saving rationale may help explain why the practice persisted so stubbornly despite the pain. Whether or not this reasoning came first or was developed later to justify a practice already in place, it shows that these communities thought carefully about the consequences of what they were doing. Now, here is where the story becomes even more remarkable, because this was not a Taiwanese custom alone, or even an Austronesian one. Ritual tooth removal appears independently in cultures scattered right across the world, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years. It is one of those extraordinary cases where humanity seems to have arrived at the same idea again and again. In ancient China, comparative studies of the practice, including work by the researcher Nakahashi, have traced evidence of ritual tooth ablation to the Shandong and northern Jiangsu region, appearing there at least 6,500 years ago and becoming very popular among the people of the Dawenku culture along the coast. In ancient Japan, the practice appears among the Jomon people, where it has been extensively studied and where different patterns of removal appear to have carried different social meanings. Travel to Australia, and the practice appears again, in an entirely separate cultural world. Among Aboriginal Australian communities, the removal of a tooth has been documented both as a rite of passage and as a sign of mourning, with many boys having a tooth removed at puberty. And among the Utalanganu people of the Cape York Peninsula, the custom carried a beautiful and intricate social logic. Before or during puberty, a young person had an upper incisor removed. Which one? The right incisor for a right-handed person, the left incisor for a left-handed person. And crucially, the person who performed the procedure came from the mother's side, the opposite half of the kinship system. The act itself was woven into the deep structure of the society's relationships. This was not a random custom. It was a precise expression of social order, written in the human mouth. And the practice appears in Africa as well. In the 19th century, the explorer David Livingstone documented communities in southern Africa where the upper front teeth were knocked out at puberty. When he asked why, the answer he was given was that their object was to be like oxen. There it is again, that same theme we saw in Taiwan, thousands of miles away, and in an entirely unconnected culture. The alteration of the teeth as a deliberate statement about the relationship between humans and animals, about what kind of creature one wishes to resemble. Step back and look at the whole picture, and something striking comes into focus. Across Asia, across the Pacific, across Australia, across Africa, human beings independently arrived at the same practice. They took up permanent, painful, irreversible action on the most visible part of their own faces, and they did it for reasons that, despite the vast cultural distances, cluster around the same handful of themes: beauty, courage, belonging, transformation. Different peoples, different centuries, different continents, and yet the same fundamental human impulses, expressed through the same startling medium. This tells us something important. Human beings do not simply inhabit their bodies. We treat them as canvases, as messages, as statements about who we are and where we belong. The tooth, the face, the smile, these are not just biological equipment. They are social documents, and ancient peoples were willing to pay a very high price, in pain and in permanence, to write on them. The research also revealed something intriguing about how these practices change across time. In Taiwan, during the Neolithic period, tooth ablation was practiced roughly equally by men and women. But by about 1900 years ago, the practice had shifted, becoming more commonly performed among women. This is a small detail, but it is a window into something larger. Cultural practices are not frozen. They drift. They take on new meanings, attach themselves to new groups, and serve new social purposes as societies change. A tradition that begins as a universal marker of adulthood might, over centuries, become a marker of something else entirely. And this brings us to what may be the deepest lesson of all. When we look at ritual tooth ablation, our first instinct is to find it shocking, even disturbing. But that reaction says as much about us as it does about them. Every human society modifies the body. Every one. We pierce ears, we tattoo skin, we cut and style hair, we straighten and whiten and cap teeth. We alter our faces and bodies in countless ways, and we consider these things normal, even beautiful, because they are ours. The ancient peoples who removed their front teeth were doing something we recognize completely, even if the specific form startles us. They were taking the raw material of the body and shaping it to say something, to announce a transition, to display courage, to mark belonging, to meet a standard of beauty that their community understood and shared. The gap in an ancient smile is not a sign of something primitive or strange. It is a message, sent across thousands of years, in a language we have almost forgotten how to read. It says, I have crossed a threshold. It says, I endured. It says, I am one of these people, and not those. It says, I am a person, not an animal. And it says all of this without a single word permanently for everyone to see. So the next time you see an ancient skull in a museum with that curious gap in the upper front teeth, do not think of it as damage or decay. Think of it as writing. Think of a young person, somewhere in the deep past, sitting down and choosing willingly to be marked for life. Think of the ceremony around them, the community watching, the meaning that everyone present understood perfectly. And think of the fact that human beings did this over and over across the entire inhabited world for thousands of years, because we have always been a species that needs to say who we are and has always been willing to write it on the only surface we truly own, ourselves. If this changed how you think about something as ordinary as a smile, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me which part surprised you most. And if you want more of this, subscribe to Simply Odd. A new video drops every week. The next one might explain something you have wondered about your whole life without ever knowing what to ask.